Is water baptism a work of man? One of the most common objections I hear regarding the salvific means of water baptism goes something like this. Baptism cannot save because it is a work, and Ephesians 2:8-9 says, not by works. For starters, the reason why most of the opposition share this sentiment about baptism is because they heard it 1,000 times from their preacher that baptism does not save you since it is a work.
The baptism does not save you. Baptism does not save you from your sin.
Now, baptism is indeed a work, but it is not a work that people often think about. Consider what the Apostle Paul says about water baptism in his letter to the Colossians.
In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead.
Did you catch that? Water baptism is the working of God. Notice what God is doing in baptism. 1. God is performing a circumcision, but Paul clarifies that it is not a physical circumcision made with hands. It is a spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of Christ. The Apostle Paul elaborates further on this in verse 13.
And you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses.
Through water baptism, God is removing the sin that is counted against us. Now, some will try to say that made without hands proves that it is not water baptism, since another man is involved in one's baptism. However, when you consider the context carefully, Paul is not telling the audience on how baptism is to be performed, but what happens in baptism. Jesus is the one doing the cutting off of sin from our soul. 2. God is raising one from the dead, being a spiritual resurrection. When one is baptized, they are both buried and raised with Christ through faith. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that raises one up from spiritual death. Now, here's what G.R. Beasley Murray, who was a Baptist scholar and a former professor of New Testament interpretation at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, said about Colossians 2:12 in his book called Baptism in the New Testament.
The apostle himself had been baptized, and the allusions to baptism in his letters assume that all other Christians have been baptized. Paul's language in Romans 6 verse 1, 1 Corinthians 12 verse 13, Colossians 2 verse 12, and 1 Corinthians 6 verse 11, if it be a baptismal passage, implies that baptism is an initiation into life in Christ and the church.
It assumes based off what? Based off previous texts in the book of Acts. And what does life in Christ mean? Salvation.
The Christians of Colossae are reminded that it is in Christ that they find fullness of life, not in inferior mediators, for the fullness of God dwells in him. They stand in no need of submission to Jewish ordinances, least of all to circumcision, since in Christ they have undergone a more radical circumcision than that to which their detractors would persuade them. They have been baptized into the circumcision of Christ on the cross.
What are the Colossians reminded of? Their baptism. And what is it that took place in their baptism? They were baptized into the circumcision of Christ. Whose work was it? God's work. What physical circumcision could not do, which was cutting off of flesh or outward removal, baptism did through Christ, which is cutting off of sin or inward removal. Here is a Baptist who gets it, and notice what his motives were.
I have striven to interpret the evidence of the New Testament as a Christian scholar, rather than as a member of a particular Christian confession.
Meaning, he did what so very few Baptists and other sectarian teachers would do, which was interpret the text as is, without inserting one's own theology. So, as for the question, is baptism a work of man? The answer is no.